I'm Phil Levine. I'm chair of the economics department, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our symposium on the global economic crisis. We had similar events in 2008 and 2009. We were fortunate enough last year to feel like we didn't need to do this, but here we are in 2011, and looks like here we go again. There's a couple of important distinctions between the event we're having now versus what we had a couple years ago. And the first big difference is that international issues seem like they're playing a much larger role in the crisis than they did a few years ago, where it seemed much more domestic. So that led us to split the symposium into two parts. Today's event will be focusing on domestic issues. On Monday, we'll be back in the same place talking about international issues. A second important difference between now and a few years ago is about the role of politics. Now, I don't mean to downplay the role that politics played a few years ago, but it's so much more obvious right now that there's a clear interaction between political outcomes and economic outcomes that we wanted to invite a couple members of the political science department to contribute to the event as well, one today and one on Monday. So today's issues will be domestic economic issues, and we have four panelists with us. So Courtney Coile is a member of the economics department. She's an expert in public finance, and she'll be talking about the U.S. federal budget. Marion, a member of the political science department, an expert in American politics, will focus on similar issues from a perspective of politics. Dan Fetter of the economics department is an expert in American economic history, and he'll address the history of financial crises and their aftermath in the United States. And our final panelist today is Dan Sichel of the economics department, who is an expert in domestic macroeconomic policy. He'll talk about the policy options at our disposal at the moment. For those of you who don't know Dan, he's visiting Wellesley just for this semester from his position as a senior associate director of the Division of Research and Statistics at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in Washington, D.C., so he's got some expertise on the topic. The format of today's events are going to be individual presentations by each of our panelists. They will each speak for no more than 8 minutes, and gongs will go off at exactly that moment. We understand that many of you, including Marion, have classes at 1:30, so we'll try to set up a moment around 1:25 or so to allow people to leave that need to. But we'll also be taking questions and answers, hopefully starting around 1:15 or so. And even after that break, when people leave to go to classes, we'll stick around for a little bit longer to answer a few more questions after that. So with no further ado, I will turn the microphone over to Courtney.
Normally, the U.S. Federal government budget is not a topic that generates a lot of excitement outside of Washington, D.C., but these are not exactly normal times. This past summer, a fellow Western democracy, Greece, experienced bloody riots when the government announced deep austerity measures designed to help that country stave off a default on its government debt. Not so long ago, this type of situation would have been completely unthinkable in the United States. But with recent increases in our own level of national debt, with a downgrade of our credit for the first time in our nation's history, and with our own nascent protest movement that we've seen over the last couple of weeks that argues that the system isn't working well for the bottom 99% of society, could a Greek-style scenario be in our future? Well, I think happily, the situation in the U.S. at the moment is nowhere near as dire as that situation in Greece, but that makes this an excellent time for us to educate ourselves about the looming budget crisis in the U.S. So in my short 8 minutes that I have with you, the three questions that I want to address are the following. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the origin of the crisis and severity of it. Second, talk a little bit about the major expenditure categories in the budget and sort of where are the drivers of growth in our deficits in the future, and finally talk about some of the options that present themselves to us for bringing our debt under control. So first, a couple of definitions just to make sure we're all on the same page. So the government budget deficit is the difference between the amount the government takes in revenues in a given year and the amount it spends in a given year. We're running kind of unusually large deficits right now as a result of the economic crisis and some of the stimulus spending, et cetera. So the deficit for the year that ended at the end of the end of September 2010 was $1.3 trillion, or about 8.5% of GDP. We often measure these things relative to the size of the economy, relative to gross domestic product. Government debt, by contrast, is the accumulation of all the deficits we've run over all the past years. So the current U.S. debt stands at just under $15 trillion, which is actually about the same as the size of the economy. I know Dan Fetter is going to talk to us a little bit about the distinction between gross and net debt, so I'll just sort of smooth that over, but suffice it to say that this is a big number. In fact, I have a couple of, it wouldn't be an economics talk without some charts and graphs, and I have a couple of slides to put these deficits and debts in historical perspective. So the first graph is showing the annual deficits that have been run by the U.S. federal government since our nation's history. And basically, just to orient you, when the spikes are pointing up from zero, that's a deficit. When they're pointing down from zero, that's a budget surplus, a year that we took in more in revenues than we spent. So what you can see is that for most of our nation's history, it was relatively unusual for the government to run deficits. And when we did run large deficits, that was associated with some kind of calamitous event in the nation's history, basically wars. So we have large deficits for the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and to a lesser extent, deficits on the order of about 5% of GDP during the years of the Great Depression. Over the last couple of decades, we have gotten a little bit addicted to overspending, and we have been running deficits sometimes on the order of that 5% of GDP that we ran during the Great Depression without having a similar calamitous event going on. And obviously, as I mentioned, right now they're spiking even higher than that, kind of getting close to 10%. This is a similar picture, but this is the debt rather than the deficit. And basically what you see is those same spikes up when we have wars and so on, but the spikes don't disappear right away. And the reason is because, of course, it only takes a couple of years to run up a lot of debt, but it takes longer than that to pay it down. So if you take the World War II spike as an example, that's the high point of debt in our nation's history. So the debt peaked at 109% of GDP, which means that if we took every dollar earned in the economy and applied it directly to paying down the debt, it would have taken more than a year to pay off the debt that was accumulated at the end of World War II. Of course, that's not what we did. We took some of our dollars and spent them on food and shelter and education and other things. So actually, over the next 30 years after World War II, it took us 30 years to whittle that debt down from 109% of GDP down to about 25%. Since then, during that period of where we as I said, started to get a little bit addicted to spending, our debt has been rising again. And by this graph, and this is the difference between the net and the gross measure, which I said I wasn't going to pay much attention to. On this graph, you can see that we're currently at a level of about 60% of GDP. Now, most economists don't think that the current level of debt is so much the problem, it's where we're going. So if you look at the rest of that picture that's following the vertical line, you can see that our debt is supposed to skyrocket very quickly. And these are projections from the Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan government agency, and they're predicting that in just 25 short years, when I guess everyone here will be middle-aged, the debt would be hitting a level of almost 200% of GDP, so well in excess of where we were at the end of World War II. So to have some sense of why it is that our debt is rising, projected to rise so rapidly, we actually need to take a step back and look at how the government spends its budget and then at what some of the drivers of the growth are. So this is a pie chart that shows you where government spending goes in a typical year. And let me first draw your attention to the red portion, which is more than half and is labeled mandatory. So in this category are programs like Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, which are the big government health care programs, and a few other things. And these are programs that are passed by a law of Congress. And of course, Congress can change these programs at any time by passing a new law. They can change the eligibility requirements, they can change the benefits, but in the absence of making a law change, these programs just sort of roll on and the spending happens automatically from year to year. So that's the mandatory spending. The little purple sliver at the top is how much we spend on the interest on the debt that we've already accumulated, and that currently is a number like 6%. And then the remaining two pie wedges, which together add up to about 40%, is the so-called discretionary spending, the funding that Congress has to approve from one year to the next. And you can see that about half of that goes to national defense, and then half of it goes to basically everything else the government does. That includes a lot of things. It's funding for cancer research, it's all the federal money on education, it's roads and bridges, it's environmental protection, it's, a million other things go into that other pie wedge that's representing about 18%. So where is the growth coming over time? So if you bear with me for a minute, there's a lot going on in this picture, but it's worth understanding. Let's start with the orange-yellow kind of bar, which represents spending on Social Security. So currently, that program is absorbing about 5% of GDP. One out of every $20 in the economy is a dollar going to a Social Security beneficiary. By 2055, about 40 years from now, that's supposed to grow from 5% of GDP to 6%. That's an increase, but it's an increase that we can probably manage. If we make some relatively minor adjustments to the program, either cutting benefits a little bit or bringing in more tax revenues, we can probably manage that increase from 5 to 6%. If you look at what's going on with healthcare, which is the red rectangle, you can see that that's growing much more rapidly, from 6% of GDP today to 14% in 2055. There's a couple of things going on there. Part of that's the aging of the population. There are going to be more Medicare beneficiaries. People are living longer, which of course is a good thing, but it means that we're going to be paying Medicare for them for more years. And some of it is the general increase in healthcare costs. You know, every year inflation goes up by about 3%, and healthcare costs go up a few percent more than that. And if you continue that out over a long period of time, that takes up a bigger and bigger bite of the economy. So healthcare is one big source of the cost increase. Something that's not a source of the cost increase is that blue rectangle. That's all the discretionary spending, defense and everything else. These projections say that those amounts would stay roughly constant, basically keep up with inflation over time. And since over time the economy should hopefully grow faster than inflation, those expenses actually become smaller relative to the economy over time. So that's not so much what's driving the cost. The real thing is the one I haven't mentioned yet, the purple. That's the interest on the government debt. So currently we're spending 1% of GDP. I said a minute ago 6% of the government budget and 1% of the national economy we're spending on interest. But in 15 years that's going to be 6%, and in 45 years that's going to be 19%. And according to projections, if we stay on the path we're on. And the really interesting comparison is to look at the green line. That's tax revenue. So right now, our tax revenue doesn't take in enough to cover what we spend, right? So that green line is not as high as the top of the blue bar. And that's the deficit, that difference. But you can see that in 2025, our revenue will only be enough to pay for the interest on the debt, Social Security, and our health programs. And that in 2055, if we stay on the path we're on, our tax revenue will only be enough to pay the interest on the federal debt and not pay for anything else, right? No spending of any kind, just interest payments. So obviously we're on an unsustainable path. So that's the depressing part of the talk. What are the options? What can we do? Well, one thing we could do is we could have further cuts in defense and discretionary spending. I said that the projections that we just saw assume that that's basically just going to grow not that quickly, like just grow with the rate of inflation, but we could grow it more slowly than inflation or even just outright cut those programs to some extent. And that will probably be part of the solution. But I hope the previous graph has convinced you it can't be all of the solution. The magnitude is just too big. You could get rid of defense and everything else the government does except for Social Security and healthcare, and you would still have a problem. So that can't be all of the solution. What are some other things we can do? Well, Social Security, as I just said a minute ago, it's part of the problem, but it's a relatively small part. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about what those small fixes are, but there's probably a set of things you could do on the benefit side or on the side of bringing in more revenue that would bring that program back into balance. What can we do about healthcare, the bigger problem? That's a bit of a challenge because, the aging of the population is just something that's happening. There's not much we can do about that. And the rise of healthcare costs is honestly something that economists don't completely know the answer to how we get a hold of that. We think that part of the answer might be to change how we pay doctors and hospitals, that right now, too often, we pay them more for providing more services when what we'd really like to do is to pay them more for providing higher quality and more efficient services. So realigning our payment system to sort of pay for the kind of care that we want, hopefully will be part of the answer. And to be honest, we could raise the eligibility age, which will obviously reduce what the government has to pay, or put more cost sharing onto beneficiaries. That's going to be painful for those individuals, but it would reduce what the government has to pay. I haven't said a word about taxes, but that needs to be part of the solution as well. And there seems to be, if not quite a consensus, a lot of energy right now for changing our tax system in a direction that would make it simpler, having a broader base and lower rates. So if I can just take a second to explain what I mean by that, the current tax system has a lot of special things built into it. If you buy a house and you're paying mortgage interest, that's not subject to tax. If you give money to charity, it's not subject to tax. If your employer pays you in health insurance premiums or puts money into a retirement account for you, that's not subject to tax. So there's a lot of interest in bringing those things into the tax base, not having those special tax exemptions, and then you could lower rates and you could still bring in a higher amount of revenue. Obviously, that's controversial. There might be good reasons we were subsidizing those activities, and for any tax break you try to take away, there's going to be a constituency that's going to fight to keep it. But there seems to be some interest in reforming the tax system in that direction. This is my last slide, and this is where I'll turn it over to Marion. Is there hope that we'll be able to actually bring our debt under control? So the green line is basically equivalent to what I showed you before, with debt skyrocketing to 100%, 187% of GDP in 25 years. The blue line commission proposal, as you may know, Obama appointed a bipartisan commission on fiscal responsibility and reform. The ideas they came up with are basically the ideas I stole from my previous slide. And if you apply all of those ideas, and with the projections that they made, the debt in 2035, instead of hitting almost 200% of GDP, would only be 40% of GDP, and it would continue to decline thereafter. So if you're asking me, have we identified ways that we could reduce government spending or bring in more tax revenue to help get the debt under control, the answer is yes. And if you're asking, do we have the political will to make these kind of changes, the answer is I don't know, but I hope Marion does. So thanks.
Thank you very much for that hopeful introduction. As you might have guessed, part of my talk is called "Why Can't We All Get Along?" or "Why Can't We Fix the Obvious?" Right? There's no doubt in anybody's mind that we are headed for the brink of disaster, that we have to do something, and that there are things we can do. So the logical assumption is that through the political process, we will do them. That turned out not to be the case so far. And so we have a very serious situation where the political will to do something about the crisis seems to be absent. And I will offer 3 reasons for its absence. One is the permanent campaign. Second is political polarization. And the third is legislative dysfunction. Dysfunction being a general term, actually, for our government at the moment. Well, let's take a look at where we stood. President Obama was elected in 2008 in the midst of terrible crisis, but the real crisis seemed to be happening in the Republican Party. Obama won the presidency. He also won a majority, a substantial majority in the House of Representatives, and a majority, a supermajority in the Senate, that is 60 votes. So that should, on the one hand, made President Obama think that he had a lot of time to solve these problems. Wrong there. And it made the Republicans think that they had lost in a very big way. That was true, absolutely. And so what could they do? They were now desperate. They lost control of the House. That means they're in the minority. They don't get any of the perks of the majority, no committee chairmanships, no money coming into their campaigns because they are in the majority, which is what happens from outside interests. So their power to have any impact on legislation is pretty much gone. And the money is drying up. So that's very serious. And this was true in the Senate, where the Democrats looked like they had a filibuster-proof majority. Of course, that changed almost immediately because a year later, Scott Brown took over the seat of Ted Kennedy. So the Democrats only had 59, but still 59 sounds like a pretty big number. But that does not take account of what the Republicans were thinking. And they're thinking, we have got to do something very desperate. We have nothing to lose. That's a very bad situation in democracy. You don't want one side thinking we have nothing to lose. So because the situation was so dire for the Republican Party, they did a lot of self-reflection. And the first thing they could do to make things better was going to occur in 2010. and that was the midterm elections that we've just come off a year ago. And to make those work, they decided they had to get support from their base. And their base was telling them the problem with George W. Bush was not that he lowered taxes, not that he lowered taxes in the midst of very expensive wars. I notice you didn't mention that, Courtney, which caused enormous deficits. And we ought to be thinking about the fact that right before George W. Bush was Bill Clinton, who, whatever his foibles might have been, one was that he created a budget surplus, right? One of those rare little bars on Courtney's graph. So we went from surplus to huge deficit under George W. Bush, right? And this is something that Obama inherited. They couldn't do much, though, the Republicans, about the situation right now. What they were really concerned about is how are they going to win in 2010 by making their base more enthusiastic than it had been. And they did that by moving to the right and basically taking a no new tax pledge again. This was one very important part. The other part is that they were particularly frightened that Obama was the kind of Democratic president who actually wanted to do something. You know, a president can come in and just kind of keep things jolly for a while, and there are activist presidents and kind of, you know, go it along Charlies. But this was a real activist president, and they knew that because he brought in health care reform, something that he thought was well on its way. And many Democrats on the left felt this is our one chance. See, get that desperate thing going again. This is our one chance to get health care passed universally so that all Americans will be like the people in all the other advanced industrialized nations and have the assurance that if they get sick, they will be taken care of in the health care system. And so this seemed like a very good thing to do. Whether it was or whether it wasn't, it certainly identified for the Republicans that this was an activist Democrat, your worst nightmare. And then this had to be resolved as soon as possible. So they took advantage of the fact that we have a constitution that's a Republican constitution. You can see the graph up there. And in order to pass a bill or to have it upheld as constitutional, which we still don't know is going to happen with the health care bill, you need not only the vigor of the executive, which was, I might say, not too vigorous, and also the legislature to pass those bills. It passed the Senate, by the way, with not a single Republican vote. So that gives you an idea of how the Republicans felt about the health care bill. But they saw it as adding to those other problems that exist in the budget that Courtney demonstrated for you, that is Social Security and Medicare. Now we would have health care as another mandatory aspect of the budget. And so there's a good argument to worry about that in the time that we were in. So let me move a little bit to how the Republicans responded to this. And let's see if we can find it. Oh, maybe we can't. The basic response was by Mitch McConnell, who announced very early in President Obama's term, Mr. Obama will be a one-term president. And if you haven't heard that phrase for a while, just hit on the latest Republican debate. That's the sort of thing that gets Republican applause a great deal because they still remember what happened to George W. Bush's father. He was a one-term president, and it's a little bit of tit for tat here. But also, the idea was they want 2008 to be an aberration, and they can return to their normal handling of the executive office, which many Republicans feel is better off in their own hands. So what can they do? Well, they can dig in these various legislative problems, because after all, you have to pass the House, but you also have to pass the Senate. And that's where we have a number of quaint rules. And one of the quaint rules of the Senate is the filibuster. How many people have heard of the filibuster? Oh, good. How many votes does it take to overcome a filibuster? I don't hear a rousing number coming from this group. I mean, it should be like trippingly coming off your tongue, but it doesn't. It's 60, and in fact, it's true that most Americans don't know that. The fewest number over here on this graph say government spends the most on Medicare. See, that's something that most people don't know. They think they probably spend it on foreign aid. But even fewer, 26% actually know that the filibuster requires 60 votes. So here they're sitting around, the Democrats have a majority, can't seem to pass anything, and the public is saying they have a majority. What's the problem? But the Republicans have figured out the problem. They can filibuster just about anything by requiring 60 votes for it, and this has led to extreme dysfunction. Let me show you a little bit about the red state, blue state problem, which I said I would address, which is polarization. Oh, I'm sorry, this is my pop soda map. This shows you where they call it Coke, which is the red states, and where they call it soda, which is the greenish, yellow, and blue states. And as you notice, there's a remarkable similarity. Well, I'll show you the next one. So it really matters what you call it, right? This is the red state and blue state map right after the 2008 elections. And as you can see, people who are more democratic tend to like water. They live near either the Pacific or the Atlantic or the Great Lakes. And so the rest of the country is kind of dry in more ways than one. And so we have a situation here. This is what Obama did, right? And he got a whole bunch of states that that Democrats don't normally get, which is, of course, obviously how he won. What happened in 2010 was, if we can find 2010, no 2010, whoops. Well, I don't have the graph. In 2010, he lost the most of these red states, and they turned, I'm sorry, he lost the red states and the blue states, and they went red. What happened to him, I think, was rather sad, because you come in and when you think you've got all of this stuff going on for you, all of those newly blue states and counties and districts, but actually you don't, because they were primarily, you heard the term blue dog Democrats, well, no reason to. That's a political sciencey thing, but it comes from the fact that you'd vote for even a yellow dog if it was a Democrat, and so the blue dogs called themselves blue dogs because they were blue, but they were also kind of red, and they were trying to make a point. That they were fiscally conservative, and so they were really tough for Obama. So he didn't have a whole lot of Democrats to count on. He had this little wing of people who were trying to satisfy their red state origins. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Will Rogers. He was a famous historical figure who was a political commentator, and he used a rope, and he would say, "I don't belong to any organized party, I'm a Democrat." And basically that was President Obama's problem, in that he couldn't depend on them. But remember, the Republicans are very organized, and they went back to their base. And they got something that they perhaps didn't deserve. They got the Tea Party. So what happened to them is basically that their party moved to the right. Let's see if we can have any luck in finding that graph. And that one shows you, let's see if we can move up a little, where the Republican Party was in the red line shows you the Republican Party back in the 70s. And as you can see, I'm sorry, this graph is red is Democrats and blue is Republicans. Okay, why we have to do that, I don't know, but in this case, the Democrats are on the left. Good. Republicans are on the right. And as you can see, the midline of the Republican Party is something short of the 0.5 there. Everybody see that? It's closer to the middle. And for the Democrats, it's also closer to 0 than it is to 0.5 on that graph. Well, that's all very well and good, but that's not what happens by the time we get into the 2000s. And you can see now the midpoint has moved in both parties to the right. The Democrats' extreme right wing has now disappeared as the Southern Democrats became Southern Republicans. But what has happened is you have quite a bit of a bulge on the right for the Republicans. And that means that they are going to be pulled. What we have is now is an asymmetrical polarization with the Republicans moving further to the right and the Democrats pretty much staying where they were. You see the two graphs pretty much looking like they did in the 70s, except maybe becoming a little bit less conservative. So that's a really striking difference, and it also became positively awful for John Boehner, because when he tried to make some compromise over the debt ceiling, the Tea Party dug in its heels and said, absolutely not, and you better be afraid, because we will put up candidates to run against your people in the primaries if you don't move in our direction. So for various reasons, one, the Republicans want to win the 2012 election. Two, the 2010 election moved them to the right. They're afraid of the Tea Party, so they absolutely will not do anything in the taxation sphere that would help to balance the budget or move us out of this crisis, and in fact will do nothing except try to make sure that Obama is a one-term president. And of course, given the employment situation, that's not so unusually bad guess on their part that he will be a one-term president, but what they have to face now is the Republican field. So remember, elections are always a choice, and so President Obama could be fairly unpopular, and he could still get reelected, and the reason he could get reelected is that people would prefer him to those who are running against him. So that's my hopeful sound on this, and I hope that whatever happens in 2012, we can move off severe dysfunction.
I'd like to, in my few minutes, give you some sense of what a broad historical perspective can tell us about some of the questions we probably have today. We often turn to history in a crisis. History gives us a guide to what happened before and what we might do now. And the first question we might ask is how we got here. And so what I've shown you here is a series on real house prices that Bob Shiller assembled for his book Irrational Exuberance. And this goes all the way back to, I think, 1890. And one of the, probably one of the first things that jumps out at you here is what happened in the 2000s. The first thing you see is that in 2005, it should have been blazingly obvious that we were in the middle of a bubble. All of you could tell me that this had to do with, house price bubble. Well, certainly this is with the benefit of hindsight. It looks like things should have looked pretty abnormal at the time, and indeed they were. And that highlights something that has been, an important theme in this book, This Time is Different, by Carmen Reinhart and Ken Rogoff. That's been discussed. It came out a couple of years ago, and it's been discussed a lot. And the basic theme of the book is precisely this: that very frequently throughout history, not if you look and say like the last 25 years, but if you look in over the course of centuries or over the course of 50 to 100 years, things like that, that credit-fueled booms are not uncommon. And everyone at the time thinks they're going to, that this time is different, that this time it's going to be fine, that this time all the fundamentals are there, that this bubble in that this increase in asset prices is justified. And every single time they've been wrong. This time has never been different. And they, one of the amazing contributions of this book is that they've assembled a data set of 66 countries over 8 centuries to show that this is true. Now, that's all remarkable. You know, in some sense, that would have been nice to know, you know, 5 years ago. It's good to know for the next time that this happens, because it will probably happen again, not to sound too depressing a note. But then the next question is, what can this tell us about what we should do now? Well, this is kind of a question about where we are. And so as part of this, their book is really, you know, expansive, and I certainly can't do it justice in, you know, an hour, let alone 5 minutes. But one of the things they do is they look at the aftermath of financial crises. And they look at the length of the recessions that are associated with financial crises. And what I've shown you here is their sort of collection of major financial crises that happened after World War II, plus the US in 1929, the Great Depression. And what they find is the average length of the decline in GDP is about 2 years, just under 2 years. Now, an important thing that's not shown in this graph is that that's a lot longer than the regular or the average length of a normal, what I'll call a normal recession, you know, a recession that's not associated with a financial crisis. On average, those were less than a year over the same period. What about the you know, other aspects? You know, at the moment, you know, the recession we've just been through, and it's technically over. I believe it technically ended. The NBER Business Cycle Dating Committee said it ended in June 2009, if I remember right. And that was 18 months. That was longer than any other post-war US recession. But we're still obviously in dire straits, and this sort of reflects that. This is the length of the cycle in unemployment, and so some sense of the time over which you have rising unemployment, and that's actually been 5 years on average. And so essentially, recessions associated with financial crises have systematically been long, protracted, you know, awful affairs. And I say that not to depress you, but I say that because it's important for thinking about current policies. You know, the measure of a policy, like the stimulus, is not whether or not we're out of the recession. You know, this was going to be an awful recession in any case. You know, the measure of a policy is what effect it would have had, or the difference between where we are now and where we would have been if the policy had not been you know, put in place. And so that's one lesson we can take from this, for thinking about the effects of policies we put together. But then, of course, I've just mentioned stimulus. The other side of that is the debt. You know, what can this tell us about the debt? And so in subsequent work, Reinhardt and Rogoff have looked at what happens to countries when they run high debts, and in particular high debt to GDP ratios. And what they find, the way they describe what they find, is essentially no relationship between debt to GDP and growth for any debt to GDP ratio less than 90%. Above 90%, you start to see lower growth, about 1 percentage point lower for the median, substantially lower on average. You know, and potentially, you know, it's not in some sense, the causality is difficult to tease out, because when GDP goes down, mechanically debt to GDP is going to go up. And so it's not clear that it's that high debt to GDP ratio reduces growth. It could be the other way around, but this could be something that we would be concerned about. And so as a final note, you know, are we running up against this debt to GDP ratio of 90%, which is not a magic number, but maybe is something to be concerned about. And I've shown you something exactly like what Courtney showed you earlier. This is the debt to GDP ratio for net debt. And the difference between gross debt and net debt is that gets a little technical, but there's some debt that's held within the government, that parts of the government owes to other parts of the government. Probably the more relevant measure for this is the net debt, the debt held by the public. And you know, even if you think 90% is some magic number, we're not there right now. We're at something like 60 to 70% of GDP. And for this reason, Peter Diamond, who's a Nobel laureate economist at MIT, speaking recently at a panel there, said that what we have right now is an unemployment crisis and a debt problem. And looking at this, that basically looks right. You know, we're at semi-historic highs for debt to GDP. It's not a historic high. You know, certainly it was higher at the end of World War II. But we are at a historic high, so clearly this is, or a semi-historic high, and so clearly this is a problem. You know, clearly we have a debt problem. But it's important to recognize that, you know, it may not be a debt crisis. And so that's something that should in turn inform policy going forward. Thank you.
So delighted to be here. As Phil said, I'm just visiting Wellesley for the fall. Really happy to be up here this fall term, and really happy to be able to participate in the symposium today. I should say at the outset that I'm only speaking for myself, not for any employer of mine that might be the Federal Reserve. Not channeling Federal Reserve Chairman today. So what I want to talk about today is to, given what we've heard, is to get a little bit into what can policy do, and to just expand a little bit on the policy end of the discussion that we've heard thus far. So I want to do this through a prism that's very important for understanding the current policy debate and for thinking about economic policy proposals that are being put forward by different groups. And in particular, to highlight a distinction between the long run and the short run, and to think about the long run policy challenge, which is government debt, as we've heard about from Courtney and Marion and Dan, and that's the long run challenge. But there's also a short run challenge, which Dan just touched on, which is the very weak economy. And we need to think about these two challenges separately, because the types of policies that might be helpful for one might not be helpful for the other, and vice versa. And indeed, policies that might be helpful for one might even on their face seem counter to what you'd want to do to solve the other problem. So to make sense of a lot of the policy discussion, very important to keep this distinction in mind. So let's look at the long run and short run challenges, keeping this distinction in mind. So starting with the long run challenge, we've heard a good bit about that today. It's the unsustainable path of deficits and debt, given the current thrust of economic policy. As Courtney highlighted, the solution is actually, as a matter of arithmetic, pretty simple. Either cut spending, raise taxes, or do some of each. The politics, as we've heard, are not so simple, and it's been very difficult for our political system to make those choices. We'll get the next glimpse into how this process works or doesn't work in November, when the Congressional Supercommittee that was established by the last budget deal issues its report around Thanksgiving in its efforts to deal with this long-term challenge of government debt. So there's also a short-term challenge, and that short-term challenge is the weak economy, as Dan mentioned. So what I've plotted here, or pulled rather from a Congressional Budget Office report, is a plot of the unemployment rate. And you can see to the left of the vertical line the run-up in the unemployment rate during the recession, and the very sharp run-up to a number around 10%, historically a very high unemployment rate. And note how the unemployment rate hangs up at that very high level, now around 9%. And note further how, as we get to the right of the dashed vertical line and we get into the Congressional Budget Office's forecast, their forecast is that the unemployment rate will stay elevated for a number of years, and then eventually come down to a number like 5.25%, which is the CBO's estimate of equilibrium unemployment. So we have unemployment that's nearly 4 percentage points higher than the Congressional Budget Office says is the equilibrium value for the unemployment rate. So that is a very nice summary statistic for the short-run economic challenge of a very weak economy, and a weak economy that, according to the economists at the Congressional Budget Office, is going to stay weak for some time. So policymakers are not only interested in the long-run challenge of government debt and dealing with that, but also interested in the short-run challenge. So on the monetary policy side, at the Federal Reserve has taken a number of steps to try to stimulate the economy, most recently some steps in August and September to ease financial conditions. A leading economic consultant, Macroeconomic Advisors, estimates that these steps will lower the unemployment rate a little bit. But Macro Advisors is quick to note limits on what monetary policy can achieve. Indeed, Chairman Bernanke has said that, in the same vein, that monetary policy is not a panacea for all that ails the U.S. economy. And Macro Advisors suggests that perhaps actually fiscal policy would be the place that one would want to look to deal with this short-run economic challenge. So where are we in terms of policies to deal with this short-run challenge? Well, the President recently proposed a jobs bill, $447 billion package. Various economists, depending on who you want to look at, these aren't Federal Reserve numbers, would say that it would lower the unemployment rate by a half percentage point to a percentage point. It'd be less if there are offsets because taxes are raised to pay for the spending and tax cuts in that program. So a couple things to note about this. One, this policy would only deal with a small amount of the short-run economic challenge of a weak economy. 4 percentage points of excess unemployment rate, maybe as much as a percentage point from the most optimistic economists about how much this policy might have done. Moreover, picking up on Marion's point, the Senate just blocked further consideration of this policy. So this policy is not getting traction for all the reasons that we've heard about. So we have a policy that would have only done a little bit, and that isn't going to make it in terms of dealing with the short-run economic challenge. So what's next? Well, there's not so much on the table. Perhaps some pieces of the president's plan will be split off and individually, some of them might be approved individually. There are some proposals for housing, refinancing, mortgage reform. Martin Feldstein, prominent economist, had a piece in the Wall Street Journal about that this morning. There's been talk about policies to deal with people who've been unemployed for a very long time. But with the president's plan kind of off the table, not so much on the table. What is on the table are many proposals that really are about dealing with the long-run problem. So many proposals for what the super committee should do for cutting taxes or raising spending in the future. So policies for reducing debt and dealing with the long-term challenge of government debt. It's hard to see how in the here and now, cutting spending or raising taxes is going to stimulate the economy. That kind of fiscal contraction in the here and now typically lowers economic activity and makes the economy worse. Another proposal that's on the table is long-term tax reform, a very sensible, smart thing to do, not something that's going to boost the economy in the short run, in the here and now, and deal with the short-run challenge of economic weakness. So in putting these pieces together and thinking about these two different economic challenges facing the country and the nation, we really need to think of them both separately and then think of them together. So in the long term, dealing with that problem requires fiscal tightening, but one would hope that that could be done in a way that doesn't hurt the economy in the short run. So that means making a credible commitment to a plan that will take care of the gap between spending and revenue in the future, but not necessarily that will put in place fiscal tightening right now. And at the same time, so that's a sense in which solving the long-term problem, if one isn't careful, might make the short-term problem worse. On the short run, most economists would say that to create economic stimulus, one would need to boost deficits, and that a short-run boost likely would increase deficits. So dealing with the short-run problem of economic weakness, we would need to take steps that might, in the short run, worsen the long-run problem. So keep this distinction in mind between the long run and the short run and the different kinds of economic challenges that the country and the economy are facing and the different kinds of policies that are appropriate for each. And what would be the preferred, although politically challenging outcome, would be to have a balance with some steps taken in the short run to deal with economic weakness at the same time that credible steps are taken to deal with the long-run problem of government debt. Thank you.
So we went a little bit longer than I was hoping. So for those of you who have to go to class, go ahead. We will stay to answer questions for those who have the opportunity to stay.
I have a question about the debt to GDP ratio. I didn't quite understand like the 90% magic number and what happens once you reach it.
Yeah, so I mean, Reinhardt and Rogoff are clear about this. 90% is not, really a magic number. It's simply the cutoff they chose to use. There actually aren't that, there's not a huge number of situations where countries have been above 90%, debt to GDP ratio in their data set. There's a decent number. But what happens is that, so essentially, if the government is borrowing more in private markets, that's going to crowd out private investment. or people start to be concerned about, creditors start being concerned about a default. And all of these things can tend to make growth slower. And so that's, those are the kinds of things that could drive growth down, when the debt is extremely high. 90% again is not a magic number. It's just, when they tend, in their data set, when countries had debt to GDP ratios above that, they happen to define it that way, and those tended to have lower growth. So.
I had a question about the Occupy Wall Street, it's called a movement, effect that may have on economic policy.
Well, that's a good question. Some people think it's a shot in the arm for the Democrats. They've wondered why it is that when 99% of the people are doing less well and have had seen pretty much lack of disposable income growth, while the top 1% is making out like bandits, that this has got to hit people at some point. And the interesting thing is that the Occupy Wall Street people are not the long-term unemployed. A lot of them are young people who are looking at this debt crisis and are looking at the unemployment ratio and saying, things are bad for us. And that's something that I think the Democrats have wondered, when people might wake up to that fact. So for them, it has an impact. Republicans, of course, call this class warfare, and that's an interesting term because one could say that the warfare of the rich against everyone else has been what we've been experiencing over the past, say, 30 years. But that's never considered class warfare because that term was coined by Karl Marx. So clearly class warfare can only come from the left. Something else happens on the right. Some people call it capitalist kleptocracy. I think that's kind of it's much too much of a mouthful. Class warfare is a lot easier to say. And I do think that it will put some legitimacy on the idea that we do have to to raise taxes as part of the package, and that probably that package should include some increase in taxes on people earning $1 million. I'm not talking about people whose assets are $1 million. I'm talking about people who are earning $1 million. And even that has been turned down on the Republican side, but I think if there's any chance for any kind of tax revenue, which I must admit, Dan, I'm not that optimistic about what this congressional committee will come up with. I think that they won't come up with anything that is called a tax. I think they might come up with a closed loophole with some other forms of revenue enhancement that you don't have to call a tax. But I think that that's where the rubber hits the road. And without that, it's going to be very hard to claim legitimacy on the solution.
Are there questions? We have no Twitter questions? Not such a brave new world after all. Okay, well, if that's the case, then thank you all for coming today.